Hello world and welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to be going all over hooks in React, and this is going to be split up into three different parts. First part is going to be kind of the beginner part of how to use hooks. We're going to be focusing on the useState hook, and essentially we're going to be getting data, or we're going to be setting a search term, and then we're going to take that search term and we're going to plug it into an API. We're going to get that data and then we're going to store that in useState, and then we're going to display that data onto the page. Very simple, very basic setup, but it helps you understand how to use state and how it kind of works. Then we're going to go into take a little intermediate step, and we're going to implement the useEffect hook. And what this useEffect hook will do will automatically fetch the data whenever you enter in anything in the search keyword. It'll just fetch it whenever that changes and reload the data onto the page. Then we're going to go into the advanced part, and we're going to extract all of that data into a custom hook. And that custom hook is going to have things like a loading, errors, and then the data itself. And then you can use that custom hook anywhere in your application to pull data and know an error state and a loading state, all in a single concise hook. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helps you. Let me know in the comments what you think down below. If I can help you out in any way, I will. I'll put the link to the Stack Blitz in the description down below. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so we have a brand new Stack Blitz React project started here. So the first thing we want to kind of show is the basic usage of the useState hook. So to get this thing started, I'm going to first create two components within this app component here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a search box component. So let's actually split this up. So say constant function search box. I'm going to do that. Constant search box is equal to like this, and it's going to return. It's just return a div. That's a search box. Okay. And normally these separate components would be in separate files, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to try to keep everything in the same file just so it's easier to follow along. Okay, so now we have the search box component. Let's just load this in like that. All right, easy enough. And now what we want is we want the component to display all of the data that you are searching for. So when you search for news, you put in your search box and then you hit get search or get news, and then the results show in this second component, which is going to be the we'll just call it news. We gotta make that component, of course. And for now, we'll just return a div like that. Oops, I'm gonna get my semicolons right, even though it doesn't really matter. All right, so we have our two components. So now styling is not going to be a major concern here. So we're just going to do a regular input component. Input type is equal to text. Look okay. All right, so we have an input box. And so now what we want is we want this input to control the state of what news we're searching for. So first, let's actually define our state up in the app component, because if we define our state here, then we can make our child component access the state. If we were to make our state within our search box component, it would be limited to only being within the search box component. It can't jump out into the parent and then back into the news. We want our state to start higher, and then this component can control it, and this component can control it right here. So that's why we're going to define the state at the top. There are other ways around that, like using context, but that's another topic for another time. So first we're going to say constant search text, and then we're going to use the set search text is equal to useState, and we'll set the default state of it to an empty string. Now useState is not defined because we have to import it from React. useState like that. Okay, so we have a basic state. We're not showing it anywhere, but let's pass it in as props. So we'll say search text is equal to search text, and then we'll say set search text is equal to set search text. All right, so now we have we're getting them as props, search text, set search text. Now ideally you would want to define these prop types, but we're not going to do that now, just for the sake of time. So now we want to connect this input into this state. We want to connect the state and the input. So we'll say the value of these input is going to be equal to whatever the search text is, and we're going to put the onChange method. So this means whenever you type a letter in or delete a letter in or you change the input, this function is going to get fired. So we're going to make a new function here. We'll say because we already have one that says set search text, but we probably need a different one. So we'll just call it the onChange. Now this method we're going to create right here, onChange is equal to, and this is a function, an anonymous arrow function, like so. And now the onChange method passes the event into its handler. So the event, just like that. And now we want to extract the value out of that event, out of an input event. So if you do constant, you can actually destructure this. You could say constant e.target.value is where it comes from. So if we say value like this is equal to e.target, then this will pull the value out. Additionally, we can do this inside of the parameters to make it even shorter code. So instead of getting the event, we're only going to say get the target within that event, and then within that target get the value. Okay, and so this will pull the value straight out of the event that comes from the onChange. So now we want to use the set search text to just put the value in there, just like that. Okay. So let's see if this works. No, it doesn't work. Why not? Set search. Oh yeah, because I misspelled this. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so now we have a stateful component. And the reason, I mean, if we didn't use any of this useState, this would have worked and that would have been an uncontrolled component. But now that we have a controlled component and the state is being controlled outside of this component, we can then access this state within another child component of the app, which is the news. So now if we pass in the search text into the news component, we should be able to pull it out and display it if we want, but we're going to do something else with it. Search text. Okay. Cool. So now let's just return search text is, and then search text in brackets like that. So now whenever you type, you can see the state, because it's controlled within the app, it is able to send it to both components. All right. So that is how you use the basic usage of the useState hook. So now what we're going to do is we are going to take that state. We're going to fetch data from this API right here, which I got from the list of public APIs. This is a news API. And the reason why I chose this one right here, this Chronicling America, is because there's no authentication. You don't have to be on an HTTPS domain, and there's no CORS. Well, there actually is CORS policy implemented, but it makes it really easy. So they have an open CORS policy. It's super easy to use this API. That's why I chose it. All it is they have this URL, and all we have to do is change this terms URL, and then maybe the page, and we want to keep the format as JSON. But that's it. We just do a fetch request to this URL, and we get the data. Super simple. So in our news component, we want to have a button here. So we're going to have a button on click. It's going to be equal to get news, and we'll just say get news, and then so const get news is equal to, now the event does go through this button on click event as well, but we don't really care what that event is. We just know when you click it, we want to do something entirely different than what the event does. So we don't need any parameters to pass through into there. We could pass the event in, but that's kind of pointless. So now once we get the news, or once we get the click event that tells us to get the news, what we want to do is we want to fetch it. So we'll go ahead and fetch, and we'll use this URL. And the way I got this URL is directly from the example they gave right here. So I just click this, or not that one. I clicked the JSON one, formatted with format equals JSON. That's how I got that URL. So we're going to take this URL, and we're going to change this Michigan term to be the search, whatever you put in the search box. So if we're going to use string interpolation, we're going to use backticks here, and now we're going to replace this term Michigan with the variable. And since we know the variable search text is coming in from the props, we should just be able to type in search text right there, get rid of Michigan, and let's change the page to 1. I don't think we'll get to pagination in the future, but if you wanted to have another state that controls the pagination, which page you're on, you could easily do that by updating this variable right here. Okay, so we're going to fetch this, and now what happens when we fetch it? Well, we want to get that response. So we want this fetch call to be what's called an asynchronous request, which means that when this function runs, we want everything to stop in this function until the data comes back. So we're going to put an async keyword here right before the parentheses, and we're going to await the fetch. Now we want this to be returned into a variable, so we're going to say response res is equal to await fetch. And now once we get that data, when we get a fetch request, it needs to be parsed as JSON. It's basically in its raw format when you initially get a fetch request back. So what we want to do is we want to say const data is equal to await res.json. So .json is a promise, which is why we can await it. And when the promise is resolved, it's a function. So you call the function, a promise is returned. And when that promise gets resolved, which means it has been translated into JSON, then it will come into this data variable, and the program will move on. So just to see what we have, let's just go ahead and console log the data, just like that. All right, so we have our console up here. Let's do, since I don't really know some actual search terms, I'll use what was there before, Michigan. Okay, so if we hit get news and our console log, we will see the API response. This is what it looks like. So we have an end index, a start index, which is where this fetch was called, how many the items there are total, and the items themselves. It looks like in items is an array of objects. Each object has a lot of different things. But for now, let's display for each item the title and is there an author, or is it just publisher? Okay, we'll just display the title and the publisher. So now what we want to do, we have this data. What do we do with this data? We got to store it in a state. Now, because this data is not going to be used outside of the news component, it's okay to store the state within the news component because nothing outside of it needs to access it as of now. So we're going to say const news and set news is equal to useState, and it's going to be set to an empty array because remember the response comes back as an array. When you search a term, there's a lot of different news objects. So we're going to set this like so, and when we get the data, we're going to go ahead and set the news to that data. Okay, and now we're going to need another item in here. We're just going to do an unordered list with each item. Yep. So now we want each item in this news array. So news.map. This will go over each object in that array. So for each item, we want to display we want to do a div, and we'll say, oh, actually no, we want to do a list item, and we want to say we want to show the item dot title, and then a dash, and then the item dot publisher. Let's see if this works. No, oh, there we go. News.map is not a function. Let's see. So news is a state. I'm wondering if it's because let's take a look at this data real quick. Make sure. Oh, I know what happened. When we fetch it, it returns an object initially. We want to set the items within that object. So we're going to say when we set the news, we're going to do data.items because we don't really care about the other items in the response. So let's try this now. There we go. We hit get news and it shows all of the news titles with their publishers next to them. Now ideally you would put the URL in, so let's do that. I believe it had a URL. So let's wrap each item in here and an a tag with the href equal to the item.url, and we'll go to the end and let's try that. Oh. So if you don't put anything, it actually does give you a response. Okay, so now if you look in the bottom left corner, you can see where the actual the URL of that data is, and this is just the full response. Probably would want something, an actual article link here or something, but this is fine for now. So we have useState working within multiple different components, and we have data passing from a child component back to its parent, back to another child, and consuming that, and then calling more data, getting that, setting the state in this child, and then re-rendering the component with all of that data. So that is the first part of this tutorial. Now for the second part, we're going to be using the useEffect hook. Yeah, it is a hook to essentially get this data automatically whenever this input is updated. So to do that, we're going to go back into our news component, and we basically want to create a useEffect. And again, we have to pull this out of the React package, useEffect, and syntax works like this. You put the function you want to run as a useEffect, and then we put the dependencies that will make this useEffect run whenever any of these dependencies change. So we want this useEffect to run, so by first putting an empty array there, that means it would run whenever this component first loads. Since there are no components, there are no dependencies in this array, it would not update ever again. However, we want this to update whenever the search text property or variable changes. So whenever search text updates, we want to essentially just run the get news. Just run that. Okay. So now when you type in Michigan, you can see it's updating every time, and we don't actually need the button anymore. So obviously this could be very dangerous. You could be making you're basically making a request every time you're typing something in. So if you have data restrictions on your API, or maybe you don't want your server being hit that much for whatever reasons, you have to be careful of this. But essentially, that's all useEffect is. It's just calling a function or doing something whenever something else updates. In this case, search text. Okay, so now we're going to get to the fun part, which is we're going to create a custom hook that will basically get this news and return to you with a loading status, the data itself if it's there, or an error. So we're going to be following the same pattern that Apollo uses from the same people who work with GraphQL libraries. So a lot of people use Apollo to query their GraphQL libraries. Well, they have a very nice API with their custom hook. They have one called useQuery, and you pass in your GraphQL query, and you pass in any parameters you have, and it returns a loading, a data, and an error, and maybe some other properties, but we're only going to focus on those three. And essentially then you do what you want with your component depending on what that data is. So we're going to create our own hook that does this, but just for the news. So we're going to say const, it has to start with the use, and we'll just say news. So all custom hooks have to start with use. That's just kind of the keyword. So I'm just going to start off with a regular function here, and we're going to pass in our useEffect into our useNews. Okay, and we're going to move our getNews function into our useNews, just like that. And now we need this custom hook to return some data. So within this custom hook, we're going to hold the state. So custom hooks are usually composed of multiple hooks. So in this case, it's going to be composed of a useState hook and a useEffect hook. So essentially it does the same thing, but now we want to return this data. So we'll return the news, and we'll just do that for now. We're going to return it in an object, and you'll see why in a second. So now if you were to say const news is equal to useNews, just like that, we're going to get this error. Search text is not defined, and that is because this variable search text, it doesn't exist yet. So this is something we need to pass into the useNews parameter. So we're going to make an object here, and we're going to pass search text. So this is just a parameter, search text. Okay, and just like that, it seems to work exactly the same way. In this way, we've extracted our data fetching into a custom hook. So this hook can be used everywhere else. So if you had another component that wanted to use this news, you just pass in the search text. Maybe you have multiple buttons. When you click a button, that uses whatever text is in that button to get the news. So you can see how extracting this out is very useful to be able to use it in multiple different components. But now let's add a little bit more info in this useNews hooks to make it more helpful. So we're going to have another state called loading and errors. So we'll say, and actually we can combine all three of these. Well, actually, I honestly don't know. There still isn't a definitive way to do this. You can split your state into a single item per state, or you can have them all in a single useState. So there's benefits and cons to each one. So when you split each one into its own state, then you don't have to set the entire state whenever you only want to change one item. You can only just update one state. However, when you want to update 3 states at once, and if it's split up into 3 different states, you're technically calling 3 different useStates, which could potentially do multiple renders on the page. Honestly, it probably doesn't really matter at this point anyways. The speed, you're not going to really be able to tell if there's 3 different renderings at the same exact time or if there's just one. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to use separate states to keep them separate, and we'll see how that goes. And if we need to optimize it, we will. So first we want to have a loading and a set loading state equals useState. And it's going to start off as false because it's not loading when it initially starts. It's only loading once it's fetching. And then we're also going to do a error and a set error is equal to useState, and there's not going to be any errors to start, so it's just going to be null. Now in our getNews function, before we start fetching, this is where we're going to start loading. So we're going to say set loading and set this to true. And then so now what we want to do is we want to put this fetch call in a try catch. So if your API fails for any reason, or if your JSON parsing fails, it'll get caught in here. So we can say catch E for error, open that up. So if it does get in this catch block, then when actually we want to move this up here too. We only want to set the data if it's there. If it gets in the catch block, but instead we're going to do is we're going to set the error to be whatever the error is that came in from the fetch or the JSON parsing, and just like that. And now we're going to have one final thing called finally, and this will happen regardless if the try happened or the catch happened. At the end we want to set loading to false. So we're done loading. Okay. So now we can pull out, well, we first have to return. Let's return the loading and the error. So now in here, in our news component, we can pull out loading and error. And now we can say, if loading is true, double ampersand, and we'll just say loading, ... I think this needs to be in a span or div or whatever. Okay, so if you type in ABC, you can actually see the API is so fast, but you can see it's there. You can see it's loading, and we have a loading component. But we need to make the data disappear, the current data, because if it's loading, then that current data is stale. So and here we'll say if it's not loading, and there's no errors, and no error, then we're going to show the list of data. Error is on a function. One on app 100. Where is this coming from? Why are you trying to? Oh, and there's no error, and just like that. So now you can see the actual data disappears once you start typing something new. And shout out to this API, it's really fast. But if I were to have a slower internet connection, it'd be a little easier to tell. Connection is slow. You'll see the loading component for more than a half a second. All right, and so now we have our custom hook. The only other thing we have to handle is the error. So if we said, if there's an error, and we'll just do a div, and we'll say error, and then we can, we want to put the message, so the error.message, and how do we want to display that? I'm thinking if we want to put this in a pre-error.message, I think that's the syntax, /div, /pre. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of fake an error here. So instead of setting the data, we're gonna throw a new error, and we're gonna say 500 server unavailable, for example. Okay, so we got some issues in our error handling. Error, I think we have one too many brackets there, and it's got to be the full 500. Okay, so there we go. We have our error handling in there. Even when you type in A, it's going to reset it, but it's always going to show this error because we're throwing this. Okay, so now we have error handling, loading, a state, and a custom hook so that you can reuse this same hook just like this anywhere you want in your application. I didn't really mention how this custom hook is working, so I kind of wanted to take a minute to explain what's happening. So the way a custom hook works is essentially it returns data every time the hook changes. So when it initially loads, the loading state is set to false, but then the useEffect comes in and it changes the loading state to true. So then that updates the response. So then in your other component, in the news component, you initially get loading is true and data is an empty array and error is null. So then your news component updates to react to that initial state, and then the useEffect happens, the fetch request happens, and the data comes back, and if it comes back successfully, then the component gets, the custom hook state gets updated, and therefore your news component, that data element will get updated, the loading property will get updated, the error, if there is an error, will get updated. So essentially a hook is just a useEffect just with other states and effects within it. And so it's just constantly updating. Whenever the use hook updates, whatever's consuming it is going to update as well. So just wanted to put that out there and clarify. All right, and that's pretty much it. I hope this video made sense to you. The link to the code is down below in the description. Let me know if you have any other questions, if you have any concern, if I made any mistakes and you caught them, or if you're having trouble implementing this. just let me know down below. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll be sure to see you next time. See ya.